Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jed. It's an honor to be on the panel with you today. And greetings to everyone who's watching this presentation today. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn. This is the unceded territory of the Lenape tribe, and I'm honored to be here. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story today about my life as an Indigenous person who has been navigating inside many of these systems, inside places of faith and religion, and also inside places of philanthropy and social investment. I grew up in North Carolina. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe, which is the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi River. And my family found religion. My grandfather was the first to become a born again Christian, and he was a person who completely, upon finding religion, completely dedicated his life to Christ and spent any free moment he had doing jail ministry in North Carolina. He had such a compassion for people who were incarcerated. And from his introduction to the church, my mother, as a result, was a part of the church. And I grew up in the church. I used to joke around saying that I was a drug addict. And what I meant by that is that I was drugged to church my entire life, from Sunday morning, Sunday night, Saturday night prayer meeting, Wednesday night Bible study. We were a part of a denomination called the United Pentecostal Church, or the UPC, which it was and I think still is, a relatively conservative evangelical type of denomination. And there were many things that the church provided to me as a young person, in terms of discipline, structure, support for our family. Absolutely, the church instilled in me a sense of service, obligation, giving, understanding that what I had was not my own, but that it belonged to God. And so those were some of the teachings from very early on that I really appreciated. My mom carried on that tradition of service from my grandfather, and she had a great passion for children, and she launched a bus ministry in our community in Raleigh, North Carolina. And every Saturday morning we went out on visitation and invited children from the neighborhood to come to church. And on Sunday mornings, we would go out and pick them up on a bus. And at a certain point in time, my mom was busing in hundreds of children to church every Sunday morning. And I learned and understood early on that although we were poor and lacking for a lot of material things, there were always folks who had it a little bit worse. And it was my place and my calling to help those in need. My sense for service and my desire to make change in the world led me to seminary right after high school. And I went to a Pentecostal seminary, a very small school in Jackson, Mississippi, and studied theology, studied Black gospel music. And really there, I had such a transformative experience around understanding what my calling was in life. I learned by the end of my time in seminary that I was not going to be a minister in an ordained kind of traditional route, but that there were other places that I would make a difference in the world. But I was forever transformed by having 3 years of time to really devote myself to study of the Bible and religion, and really learning to become a minister, how to connect to people, how to listen, how to understand, how to be empathetic and supportive of others in their ups and downs of life. So as I came into adulthood, had to find my own place, my own understanding of who I was as a person, my own spirituality, what I believed. Coming from a denomination and a faith tradition that was very literal, took the Bible very, very literal, very strong articles of faith, ideology around separation from the world and holiness. There was very much an assimilation kind of process as a part of that church, where you were expected to dress a certain way, to carry yourself a certain way. Some folks may recognize the word holiness. It was a holiness church. And for me, I think as an Indigenous person, being the only Native American in our church, in my school, in my community, I completely became sort of colonized, as you might say, and assimilated to the ideology and the values of this faith community. That's in some ways reinforced ideas at times about us versus them, and how we were to come out and be separate from the world. And so this ideology around separation was something that I think I struggled with later in life as I was trying to shift my thinking and really begin to decolonize how I showed up in the world and my worldview. That led me, into adulthood on a journey of really an identity crisis. And then I find myself working in the space of philanthropy, which is this sector that has an inherent amount of power and privilege. And being from my background of poverty and being Indigenous and finding myself working in that space, it was a whole nother ideology and identity that I grappled with, wanting to go about doing good work, lots of good intentions, but there were a lot of contradictions and complexities in the space. I will say that faith for me has been the underpinning for everything that I have done in my work. It is very mission related, and still really remains strong and drives what I do today. But yet I would be lying if I didn't say that I did not have numerous painful experiences as a result of being a part of faith communities at times. And I've also had painful experiences working inside the space of philanthropy. And those painful experiences are what really drove me to write a book. I set out through my own quest for healing to explore what I really believed about myself, and to really try to dive into Indigenous spirituality and open my mind to believe something different, and to explore the role of philanthropy and money in the world. And once I began to understand that the stories that have been taught to me were optional, and that the choices that we often make and the choices I have made are optional, we can choose to let go of beliefs, any beliefs that limit us. Every obstacle can be incorporated to become an ally, another beautiful aspect of authentic wholeness. A free imagination is key to overcoming limited beliefs. And so for me, the central question around much of the work that I do is what if? And I think that what if is a legitimate tool to really imagine healing, to imagine reconstructing a world. And just asking the question of what if opens us up to a radically different possibility for reality that can lead to healing and a greater sense of dignity and purpose. I began to understand that the ideology of white supremacy was a story that had just been made up. That the ideology I had internalized around capitalism and resources being scarce and limited were stories that had been made up and taught to me. And I began this journey to really understand Indigenous teachings and values, such as like all my relations, like really opening my mind to believe that we are really related, that our interdependence is interconnected, and the decisions that I make impact you, and the decisions that I make today actually impact 7 generations down the road. The ideology of reciprocity, that I give to you and care for you because I know you're going to do the same for me. These were not new ideas for me per se, but as I really opened my mind and submitted myself to Indigenous wisdom and teaching for my community, I began this process of decolonizing myself and really shifting my worldview from one that was very assimilated to the ideas of separation, individualism, to a place of thinking about ourselves very differently. This led me in my work to ask questions about money and to really wonder, about that scripture in the Bible that I often heard growing up, that the love of money was the root of all evil. And I find myself as an adult coming into my sort of new spiritual self and working with money and running into barriers for using that money in a way that I thought was most impactful in communities. And wondering if this was the right space for me to be in. And during the time of writing the book, I had this amazing encounter with an elder who said to me that, Edgar, the medicine that has chosen you is money. And at first I didn't quite understand what that meant. Like, how could money be medicine, and why did it choose me? As I really dove into that and sat with that for months to come, I began to look back in our history and understand the history of colonization in the United States, and how that violent force of dividing, conquering, exploiting, oppressing folks, many times in the name of God, was very connected to the accumulation of wealth and ideas of hoarding and of harming people and of harming the planet, all in the name of amassing wealth. And understanding that history of colonization had bred in me and in many others ideas of fear and scarcity and blame, which all arise when we think that we're not in this thing together, this thing called life. I began to understand that colonization was like a virus. And I talk about the colonizer virus and the ideology behind colonization, how it is still very much present. It's not a thing of history. It's something that we still see in our policies. We see the colonizer virus in our public education system, and we absolutely see the colonizer virus at play in the ways that we use money, and we see in the ways that we invest money. You know, I now believe in truth more than ever, and calling things as they are, not in a way to throw people under the bus or to make people feel bad about themselves. But I think for all of us to get to a true place of healing, we have to name things as they are. And we have to be respectful to the history and understand and ask the hard questions about where wealth came from in the first place. And acknowledge that wealth has been built for the most part in this country on the backs of people of color and through very violent acts of slavery and genocide and stolen land. I believe as a person of faith in the power of truth and reconciliation. And as I tapped into indigenous wisdom and began to understand ideas around restorative justice and healing, I began to understand that I, as a Native person, had internalized colonization, that I could decolonize my mind and my thinking, and as a process of healing to come into my true self of identity. And in doing so, I could find forgiveness for others and grace for the journey that others may be on. The idea of restorative justice is something that is deeply rooted in indigenous wisdom, and it's also deeply rooted in spirituality. And so I've been on a path to embrace those ideas and to embrace the idea of both and, right? The world is complicated. How can I be a Christian and be Native American at the same time, right? These are ideas that we grapple with in a linear way of thinking that I've chosen to disband and to accept the fact that I can be all the things all at the same time. So I move into a close here. I just want to say that as this pertains to money in the spaces of philanthropy, wealth management, social impact investing that I work now, I often think about how to use money in a way that is respectful to our racist history in this country. I want you to understand today, if nothing else, my definition of poverty. Poverty is a product of public policy and theft that has been facilitated by white supremacy. And so in our efforts to use money in a different way to alleviate poverty, to dismantle poverty, we must use money to change public policy, right? Like, intentional public policy has led to poverty. We must change policy, and we must acknowledge the theft that has taken place. So I'm in support of moving massive amounts of capital back into communities of color, and doing so in a way that dismantles white supremacy that has facilitated colonization and has facilitated the racial wealth gap that we now see. This is beyond just making some good grants or making some good investments. We need to move serious chunks of capital back into communities of color in a way that supports and respects self-determination of those communities to use that wealth to drive their own solutions. I have asked for a tithing. You'll see my Christian ideology coming into play here in some of the aspects of the book. But I think that foundations, for one, could take 10% of their endowments as a tithing and just hand that over to communities of color. I'm speaking beyond the grant making, right? We have a long ways to go to be equitable in our grant making. But again, to get to a place of transformation, to rapidly close the race wealth gap, we have to tap into those endowments and liberate that capital, like serious amounts of capital. And I think 10% as a tithing is a good place to start the conversation. And then the last thing I'll just say, I'm looking forward to hearing the responses and having Q&A with you, is that all of us have to think about using money differently, thinking about how can we use our resources for healing. And we know that the pain is the worst in communities of color. So if we're using money as medicine, we have to invest in and deploy capital to communities of color to support healing and at least to stop more harm from happening in those communities. Thank you.